¿Y cuánto tiempo tiene así?
30 años. Acuérdate de que cuando viniste tú.
Pero no cerraba.
No, pero tiraba poquito. Ahorita está tirando más. Acuérdate.
The landlord drilled a hole during the time that she was in here and ran an extension cord that connected to this outlet here. So right now she owes about $1,000.
So she owes $1,100 on a electric bill?
Yes. ¿Usted se queja sobre las cosas que pasan, que necesitan arreglo en la unidad?
No, lo que dice que si uno quiere, que si uno quiere gusta.
Yeah, she does, and she'll tell her, well, if you don't like it, you can move.
The sheriff brought this morning. He woke me up and knocked at my door, and he said, "This is a summons." At 6:45,
So
he
he
was at my
paid to
door.
serve you.
He said, "Oh, we don't want you here. We're tired. You complain. You're this and that. Why don't you just leave? You know, only reason why I put up with you is because you had a disabled son." And I just broke into tears because I thought that was horrible.
I don't make 3 times $900, but I'll guarantee you my rent before I eat.
Yeah.
You know, so thanks. That'll really
All right,
help.
hey, take care, okay?
Thanks a lot.
That tenant I look at, I see my parents. Just seeing the lady go, yeah, pretty much, like there's nothing I can do. I fight back, I'm gonna end up in the streets. And it's like, it's reality.
This is the original deed to this whole development, 252 units. No lot in said tract shall at any time be lived upon by a person whose blood is not entirely that of the Caucasian race. And for the purpose of this paragraph, no Japanese, Chinese, Mexican, Hindu, or any person of the Ethiopian, Indian, or Mongolian races shall be deemed to be a Caucasian. As a Mexican American, I would have been forbidden from purchasing this house. It's as if the Jim Crow signs for water fountains of blacks only and whites only were still out there, and people just said, ignore the signs. You can use either water fountain. It's fine. Ignore the signs. These documents are there. We can ignore them, which is what we're doing, or we can get rid of them.
It's critical to realize that the United States was actually founded on someone else's property. Manifest destiny, when people moved from the eastern seaboard across the Midwest and on through the western United States to California, really had underneath it the idea that just because somebody lived there, if they were not utilizing the property in its highest and best use, that therefore that property could be taken. I mean, that's the justification for taking land from Native Americans, that they're not using it to produce crops for commercial market, that they're not using it to put trains to connect cities to commerce, that somehow that land is being underutilized.
When you look back after the Mexican-American War, the Land Act of 1851 raised the standard for documentation and allowed all kinds of challenges to the claims that people had on land, pushing Native Californians, Mexican Californians off their land because white property interests challenged their right to own that land. And that kind of set a precedent in California for essentially challenging the rights of people of color to own property.
So while we see these issues of land teased out through this Land Act bureaucracy, we also have the gold rush in California. We now have this influx of cheap labor from Asia. And as this gold rush goes through its decline, the Chinese learned how to farm here, became entrepreneurs, restaurants, laundry shops. It made a lot of people nervous about them being able to accumulate wealth. Now we start seeing things like Asian land laws where they weren't allowed to own property anymore.
At the turn of the last century, you saw this enormous migration of African Americans from the South to escape overt racism, lynching, complete dearth of opportunity.
The early 1900s is when we start seeing the rise of the real estate industry in the United States. Developers are starting to learn how to build large-scale developments, shopping centers, and in the development of all of these new subdivisions, the real estate industry starts using race covenants to ensure that there's a distance between white and black populations. Then you start seeing the rise of things like a code of ethics. The Real Estate Code of Ethics was designed to bring uniformity to how realtors approach selling property across the United States. But what it had in it is that you couldn't introduce people from a different ethnic or racial class that would be detrimental to the property values of others. Once we made that connection between value and race, then it was very easy to justify anything because it was no longer a moral issue, it was a financial issue. So as the real estate industry rolls out these race covenants throughout the United States, we see that the only people really owning property are basically wealthy white folks. Back then, you've seen the loans amortized over 5 years. I mean, you're paying that full mortgage within 5 years. Now, as we're moving up into the Great Depression, well, it means a lot of people went belly up because they couldn't pay those loans after 5 years and the property values diminished. They couldn't refinance. This is actually marking the point when the federal government becomes involved in urban planning. This is when we developed the Federal Housing Administration to revamp our mortgage industry. This is when you see the onset of the 30-year loan. And when these payments became cheaper than rent, it made home ownership accessible to anybody.
Look at the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps, the redlining maps. The federal government basically would divide up cities and communities into various different strata, like cuts of beef. And they would have green areas, which were very desirable and highly investable, blue areas, also desirable and highly investable. Then they had yellow areas that are slightly higher risk, so be careful. And then they had red zones. In those red areas, they basically wouldn't back mortgages or insurance policies.
This is something that happened all over our country. There are people who never got to pass on homes to their children. There were people who never got to build up credit. There were entire neighborhoods that were deprived of investment opportunities. And so when you're talking about institutionalized racism, those are the institutions that manufacture relationships and opportunities in a city.
African-American populations were primarily an immigrant population to California in and around the world wars, but mostly around World War II. And this is because of the industrial demands driven by the war, production of airplanes, of ships, and you see shipbuilding yards in places like Richmond and Oakland. And this created an incredible draw for job seekers, particularly out of the South.
In the middle of World War II, the Japanese were interned, which causes a labor shortage throughout California. And in order to compensate for that labor shortage, we bring in Mexican labor from the South through a program called the Bracero.
And then after the war ended, there was this massive policy shift to suburbs.
We build the schools out there. We put the churches, the shopping centers.
the very creation of suburbs themselves, they were created as white spaces, distant from the teeming multicultural city.
Growth of the freeways, the growth of the automobile, the freeway system was a paved escape valve for white flight out of America's cities. So it led to segregation and disinvestment from the city.
35th Street, Oak Park, once a bustling shopping center, now a burned out shell, symbol of a ghetto.
Tell me, what do you think caused the decline?
I don't really care to comment on that.
White people would be told that black people were moving into their neighborhood and that property values were going to go down. Then the real estate folks would get them to sell their houses really inexpensively. Then they would inflate the prices for kind of housing-starved people of color.
Tell me, what about real estate agents trying to move white people out and move black people in? Do you think that caused a problem?
Yes, because they thought they were going to make big profits on it.
In America, there were two markets in housing, one for white people and one for everybody else. And that second market didn't have rules, it didn't have guarantees, it didn't have the federal government underwriting some of the products that were being provided to people. You've got essentially uninsurable properties, and we saw this in the process of the mortgage and foreclosure crisis, where that whole secondary predatory market was then bundled into these derivatives and then sold as financial instruments, and that led to not only the collapse of that market, but the collapse of the entire U.S. market.
So what's worse, like denying loans to people in the community, or to give them untenable loans so that they not only lose their house, but lose their life savings that they invested to buy the house.
We're in the midst of a serious financial crisis. I propose that the federal government supply urgently needed money so banks and other financial institutions can avoid collapse and resume lending.
We bailed out the banks, and we didn't take care of the people.
And now we have the feds who have all of these foreclosures on the books. So they start selling these dead loans in bulk to large-scale investors. Blackstone was one of them, really the primary driver behind this. And so they would buy these foreclosed homes on the cheap, then they would rent them out. This is where you start seeing the transformation in the attitudes being sold to us as, renting is a good thing now.
Home ownership sort of remains a barrier for some in this country, right? And then they rent as a result.
I think it's less about a barrier as a lifestyle choice today. What you're actually seeing is people are choosing to rent their lifestyles.
You don't need to own your home. We'll take care of all these things. Don't worry about paying those taxes. Don't worry about mowing that lawn.
Do you think there's an opportunity to consolidate some of this industry?
There's no reason why this industry shouldn't consolidate to 2 or 3 million homes that are institutionally owned and try.
Less people own more property. So not that there's less people owning property, but that there's fewer people who own larger amounts of properties.
Home ownership is really key to this wealth accumulation process. And we're telling people that you really don't need to own your house. We're really shutting down these important pathways of wealth accumulation, and this racial spatial wealth gap continues to widen.
So this notion that there's a free market and everybody participates in it, the free market determines who gets what and where people live, is a complete lie in America. It doesn't exist. The federal government, state governments, local government have had a hand in that marketplace throughout our history to shape how our communities look, to push resources to certain parts of communities to benefit certain populations.
And that structure, which led to persistent disadvantage, not just in terms of making a home, but in terms of the ability to have power and voice in a society, has in many ways continued forward to this day.